What happens when a decorated war veteran and sitting United States Senator gets ambushed on late-night television by a host who clearly came prepared for battle? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive interviews in recent memory, where Senator Tammy Duckworth found herself facing off against Stephen Colbert in what started as a routine appearance, but quickly devolved into a hostile confrontation that typical political disagreement or lighthearted banter gone wrong. This was a calculated attack, disguised as comedy, where Colbert seemed determined to corner Duckworth on her military service, her legislative record, and her personal beliefs in ways that crossed every line of journalistic integrity. What you're about to hear will shock you, not just because of how aggressively Colbert pursued his questioning, but because of how a respected television host completely abandoned any pretense of fairness or basic human decency. Before we get into the explosive details of this confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts using their platform to ambush guests. Now, let's dive into exactly what went down when Senator Duckworth walked into what she thought would be a friendly interview. The interview began innocuously enough, with Colbert welcoming Senator Duckworth to thunderous applause from his studio audience. She walked out with her characteristic poise, the double amputee veteran, moving confidently to her seat as Colbert flashed his trademark grin. Smile seemed forced, his usual warmth replaced by something that felt almost predatory. "Senator Duckworth, thank you for being here," Colbert said, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't typical for his guest introductions. "I have to say, it's fascinating to have someone on the show who's made such a career out of, well, let's call it playing the victim card." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful political ribbing that Colbert was known for. Duckworth's expression remained composed, but you could see her shoulders tense slightly. "I'm sorry, Stephen, but I'm not sure what you mean by that." A hostile witness. "Oh, come on, Senator. Your entire political identity is built around your military service and your injuries. Every speech, every interview, every piece of legislation you propose, you somehow manage to circle back to what happened to you in Iraq. Don't you think the American people deserve representatives who can talk about issues without constantly referencing their personal trauma?" The studio fell silent. This wasn't comedy anymore. This was a direct attack on a woman who had literally given her legs in service to her country. "Stephen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about why I'm here tonight. I came to discuss the infrastructure bill and veterans' health care reform." "Right, veterans' health care," Colbert interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Senator, how do we know that your advocacy for disabled veterans isn't just elaborate self-interest? How do we separate Tammy Duckworth, the advocate, from Tammy Duckworth, the beneficiary?" Several audience members could be heard shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and there were a few audible gasps. Duckworth's media training kicked in, and she attempted to redirect the conversation. "Stephen, I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here. Myself, perhaps we could discuss the specific provisions of the legislation." But Colbert wasn't interested in policy discussions. He had clearly come prepared with a different agenda entirely. "You know what I find interesting, Senator? You talk a lot about service and sacrifice, but you've been in the Senate for years now, and what do you really have to show for it? I mean, besides the obvious personal financial benefits of holding office while drawing disability compensation, the attack was so brazen, so completely inappropriate, that even Colbert's production team seemed stunned. Camera operators could be seen glancing at each other uncertainly, and the usually responsive audience had gone completely quiet. Duckworth's composure finally began to crack, not from emotion, but from sheer disbelief at what she was experiencing. "I'm going to stop you right there," Duckworth said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "What you're suggesting is not only factually incorrect, it's deeply offensive. My military disability compensation is separate from my Senate salary, as it is for every disabled veteran, and the implication that I've somehow profited inappropriately from my service is beneath contempt." Colbert seemed energized by her pushback, as if this was exactly the reaction he had been hoping to provoke. Beneath contempt, that's interesting language from someone who's made contempt for questioning her record into an art form. "Tell me, Senator, do you think your military service makes you immune from criticism? Because that seems to be how you operate in Washington?" The host was now fully committed to his attack, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't spontaneous hostility. but a carefully planned ambush. Duckworth looked toward the production area, clearly wondering if someone was going to intervene. But Colbert pressed on relentlessly. "I've been doing some research into your voting record, and I have to ask, do you ever vote against veterans' interests? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've created a very comfortable little ecosystem, where Tammy Duckworth, the senator, advocates for Tammy Duckworth, the disabled veteran." The accusation was so far beyond the bounds of reasonable discourse that Duckworth actually laughed. But it was the kind of laugh that comes from complete incredulity rather than amusement. "Stephen, I honestly don't know what's happening here. But this isn't an interview. It's an interrogation based on completely false premises." Colbert's response revealed just how deep his preparation for this ambush had gone, and how far he was willing to push things. Colbert's response revealed just how deep his preparation for this ambush had gone, and how far he was willing to push things. He reached under his desk and pulled out a thick folder, slapping it down on his interview table with theatrical flair. "False premises. Senator, I've got documentation here that raises some very interesting questions about your record. Let's talk about your husband's consulting business and how many of his clients just happen to benefit from legislation you've supported." The audience was now visibly uncomfortable, with several people looking around as if wondering whether they should leave. This had moved so far beyond political comedy that it felt more like a public execution disguised as entertainment. Duckworth's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. But she maintained her composure with the discipline of someone trained for high-stress situations. "Stephen, what you're doing right now is engaging in conspiracy theories and character assassination. My husband's business activities are completely separate from my legislative work, and they're fully disclosed according to Senate ethics requirements. The fact that you would ambush a guest with innuendo and unsubstantiated allegations says far more about you than it does about me." But Colbert was just getting started. He opened the folder with a flourish, pulling out what appeared to be printed documents. "Unsubstantiated? Let's talk about the timing of some of your husband's contracts. Isn't it convenient how his environmental consulting firm landed several major projects right around the time you were pushing green infrastructure spending?" The attack was so brazenly inappropriate that several audience members actually stood up to leave, but Colbert seemed oblivious to the growing discomfort in his own studio. Duckworth leaned forward, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Stephen, I don't know what game you think you're playing here, but these accusations are not only false, they're defamatory. Are you really going to sit there and suggest that I've somehow corrupted my office for personal gain?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Colbert," replied with mock innocence. "I'm asking questions that I think the American people deserve answers to. And frankly, Senator, your defensiveness is pretty telling. If everything is above board, why not just answer the questions?" The manipulation in his response was breathtaking in its cynicism. By framing his attack as legitimate questioning and then characterizing her reasonable objections as defensiveness, Colbert was employing classic harassment tactics disguised as journalism. Duckworth recognized the game immediately. "This isn't questioning, Stephen. This is a coordinated attack based on false information. You're not a journalist conducting an investigation. You're a comedian who's decided to abandon comedy in favor of character assassination. And frankly, I'm wondering who put you up to this, because this level of preparation doesn't happen in a vacuum." The suggestion that Colbert might be acting at someone else's behest seemed to hit a nerve. His carefully constructed facade of righteous inquiry cracked slightly, revealing something nastier underneath. "Nobody put me up to anything, Senator. Maybe it's just refreshing to have someone in media who's willing to ask tough questions instead of treating you like some untouchable war hero." "Tough questions?" Duckworth's voice rose slightly, the first time her composure had truly wavered. "Tough questions are about policy, about voting records, about the challenges facing our country. What you're doing is spreading innuendo and conspiracy theories while hiding behind the pretense of comedy. This isn't tough journalism. It's cowardly ambush tactics." Colbert's mask slipped completely then, revealing the full extent of his hostility. "Cowardly. That's rich coming from someone who's built their entire career on tragedy. Tell me, Senator, do you ever get tired of playing the wounded warrior? Do you ever consider that maybe, just maybe, the American people want representatives who can discuss issues without constantly reminding everyone of their personal sacrifices?" The cruelty of the attack was stunning. To suggest that a double Amputee veteran was somehow exploiting her own injuries for political gain crossed every conceivable line of decency. The audience had gone from uncomfortable to actively hostile toward their host. With audible murmurs of disapproval rippling through the studio, Duckworth stood up then, her prosthetic legs clearly visible as she rose from the interview chair. "Stephen, I've been in politics long enough to expect attacks on my positions, my votes, even my judgment. But what you're doing here tonight is attacking my service, my integrity, and my family based on nothing but innuendo and malice. I won't sit here and be part of whatever this performance is supposed to be." But Colbert wasn't finished. As Duckworth began to remove her microphone, he launched into what would become the most shocking part of the entire confrontation. "Running away, Senator. I guess that's one way to handle tough questions, though I suppose we shouldn't be surprised given your track record of avoiding real accountability." The implication was clear and absolutely devastating. By suggesting that a woman who had literally flown combat missions in Iraq was somehow running away from confrontation, Colbert revealed the true depth of his contempt. Duckworth turned back toward him, her expression now showing the kind of controlled fury that comes from a lifetime of military discipline barely containing righteous anger. "My track record," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "My track record includes flying combat missions over Iraq until an RPG took down my helicopter and cost me both my legs. My track record includes spending months in recovery, learning to walk. Again, so I could continue serving my country. My track record includes working in the Senate to make sure other veterans don't face the challenges I faced. What's your track record, Stephen? Making jokes and attacking people who've sacrificed more than you can imagine?" The confrontation had reached a boiling point, and what happened next would make television history for all the wrong reasons. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, and what happened next would make television history for all the wrong reasons. Standing up behind his desk, he pointed directly at Duckworth, with a fury that seemed to surprise even him. "You know what, Senator? I'm sick and tired of people like you hiding behind your service record every time someone dares to question your actions. You think being wounded in Iraq gives you some kind of moral authority that the rest of us don't. Have you think it makes you untouchable? Well, newsflash, your sacrifice doesn't make your policies any less wrong, and it doesn't make your ethics any cleaner." The studio audience was now openly hostile toward Colbert, with several people shouting objections and others heading for the exits. But the host seemed to have lost all awareness of his surroundings, consumed by whatever personal animus was driving this unprecedented attack. Duckworth, meanwhile, stood perfectly still, watching Colbert's meltdown with the kind of calm that comes from facing genuinely dangerous situations. "You want to talk about track records?" Colbert continued, his voice rising to a near shout. "Let's talk about how you've voted on immigration, how you've handled committee assignments, how you've used your position to benefit your allies. But no, we can't have that conversation, because the moment anyone asks a real question, you wave your Purple Heart around like it's a get-out-of-jail-free card." The attack on her Purple Heart was so beyond the pale that even Colbert's own production team seemed stunned. Camera operators were looking to their directors for guidance, and you could see stage managers frantically trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Duckworth's response was measured and devastating in its simplicity. "Stephen, I've never once used my military service to avoid answering legitimate questions about my policy positions. What I won't do is sit here and allow you to spread lies about my family, my ethics, and my motivations while pretending it's somehow legitimate journalism. You've spent the last 20 minutes making accusations without evidence, promoting conspiracy theories, and now attacking the very concept of military service itself. This isn't comedy, and it isn't journalism. It's just cruelty." But Colbert was too far gone to recognize the wisdom in backing down. Instead, he doubled down on his attacks, pulling more papers from his folder and waving them in the air like weapons. "Cruelty. You want to know what's cruel? What's cruel is voters being told they can't question their representatives because those representatives have suffered." The host's argument was falling apart under its own weight, but he seemed incapable of stopping. "You talk about serving your country, Senator, but what about serving your constituents? What about the people in Illinois who are struggling with real problems while you're focused on veterans' issues that, let's be honest, primarily benefit you and people like you?" Suggestion that advocating for veterans was somehow selfish was so tone-deaf that it drew audible gasps from the remaining audience members. Duckworth shook her head slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Stephen, there are 22 million veterans in this country. When I advocate for veterans' health care, housing assistance, education benefits, and employment programs, I'm advocating for 22 million Americans and their families. The idea that this is somehow selfish or self-serving reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what public service means." Her response was so reasonable, so clearly grounded in facts and genuine concern for others, that it made Colbert's attacks look even more unhinged by comparison. But rather than recognizing this, he seemed to take her composure as a personal affront. "Public service," he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is that what we're calling it when politicians use their personal tragedy to build their brand? Because that's what this looks like from where I'm sitting. You've turned your injuries into a political commodity, and now you're offended that someone finally called you out on it." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. To suggest that a woman who had lost both legs in service to her country was somehow commercializing her own trauma was beyond any reasonable standard of discourse. The audience was now actively booing Colbert, something that rarely happened in his own studio. Duckworth began walking toward the edge of the stage, clearly intending to leave, but Colbert's next words stopped her in her tracks. "That's right, Senator. Walk away. Just like you walked away from really fighting for progressive values when it mattered. Just like you walked away from standing up to corporate interests when they conflicted with your donors." The accusation was not only false, but deliberately designed to inflict maximum damage. Duckworth's voting record was consistently progressive, and her fundraising came primarily from small donors and labor unions. Colbert was now simply making things up, but he was doing so with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing his platform gave him the power to spread lies to millions of viewers. "You know what's really interesting, Stephen?" Duckworth said, turning back to face him one final time. "In all of this, you haven't asked me a single substantive question about policy. You haven't asked about infrastructure, healthcare, education, immigration, or any of the issues that actually matter to the American people. Instead, you've spent this entire time attacking my character, my family, my service, and my motivations. And you've done it based on nothing but innuendo and conspiracy theories." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the studio. "If this is what passes for political discourse in your world, then I feel sorry for your viewers. They deserve better than this performance art, masquerading as journalism." Colbert's final response revealed the full depth of his malice. "Art. You want to talk about performance art? How about we talk about the performance of being a wounded warrior politician? How about we discuss the theater of disability in American politics? Because that's what this is, Senator. You've turned your injuries into a political costume, and you wear it every time someone tries to hold you accountable." The attack on her disability was so shocking that several audience members actually booed loudly enough to be heard over the studio microphones. Even Colbert's own staff seemed appalled. With several people visible in the background shaking their heads or covering, "Stephen, I've faced enemy fire, survived a helicopter crash, endured months of painful rehabilitation, and worked every day since then to serve my country and my constituents. If you think any of that was a performance, then you fundamentally misunderstand what service means." She began walking toward the exit again, but Colbert wasn't finished. "Service. Let's talk about service, because that's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Turning tragedy into opportunity, sacrifice into profit, service into self-advancement." The accusations were now so completely divorced from reality that they bordered on delusional, but Colbert seemed genuinely convinced of his own righteousness. As Duckworth reached the edge of the stage, she turned back one final time. "This isn't an interview, it's not comedy, and it's not journalism. It's just cruelty for its own sake, and I won't be part of it." As she began to leave, Colbert shouted after her, "Run away, Senator, just like you always do when the questions get too tough." But his words were drowned out by the sound of the audience booing their own host. A remarkable turn of events that seemed to finally penetrate Colbert's awareness of what he had done. Security personnel appeared at the edge of the stage, not to escort Duckworth out, but to protect her from any further harassment as she left. The unprecedented scene of a respected television host being abandoned by his own audience while security Protected his guest from him marked one of the most shameful moments in late-night television history. As the show cut to commercial, viewers were left wondering how one of America's most trusted comedic voices had transformed into something so ugly and cruel. The answer to that question would spark conversations about media responsibility, political discourse, and the treatment of veterans that would continue long after the camera stopped rolling. What did you think about this explosive confrontation? Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments. Should television hosts be held accountable when they cross the line from comedy into cruelty?